We are now excited to be joined by a very special guest, Zac Blackerby of the Locked On Auburn podcast, joining us today. Zach got a lot of things going on over at Locked On Auburn, but one of the more recent conversations that you've been having on the podcast that kind of piqued my interest is you're really diving into this quarterback battle. Obviously, Demetrius Davis entering the transfer portal, so the Auburn quarterback battle is now down to four different players: Holden Gariner, Robby Ashford, Zach Calzada, and TJ Finley. What have you seen out of these four guys so far during spring practice?
Yeah, well, we haven't seen much of Calzada at all, right? I mean, in that yellow limited jersey due to that that non-throwing shoulder. So, that's a bummer. And Harson confirming late last week that it's going to stay that way. It's not really going to change. And so that's a bummer. I think that's what a lot of people kind of expected him to come in and win the starting job. And, how much of a true competition can you have when maybe the favorite going into all of this isn't able to come in and compete? So that's an interesting element of all of this. I'll tell you what, Robby Ashford has impressed me. I didn't really get his transfer announcement when he decided he was coming in, but it sounds like he's working his tail off. It sounds like he's impressing his teammates and his coaches. And so right now, with Calzada not practicing, it seems like Ashford is getting most of the number 2 reps. But TJ Finley, man, TJ Finley, I think is a hungry player coming into all of this. It seems like the biggest thing was his accuracy and just kind of processing the game of football. And he has really impressed folks from what I've seen. And, during these open practice windows, media has talked nonstop about how impressive his accuracy looks as far as the improvement from where it was when we saw him up in Birmingham in that loss to Houston. And so that's something that I think Auburn fans should be excited about, Lance. And then Holden Gariner, I think he looks really sharp for a freshman, but I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of him in 2022. And I think that was the plan all along. I don't think that's a surprise, but he certainly looks the part as a true freshman. But I think in all of this, the biggest takeaway is I think TJ Finley has taken a big step forward.
I'm really excited about the competition that Auburn currently has going on at the quarterback position. And, from what I've heard, Robby Ashford came in, and one of the biggest things, one of the lures to Auburn football for him was the fact that he could come in and actually compete. And we've gotten to see him in spring practice working on his accuracy as well as TJ Finley. And like you said, I'm impressed with what Finley has done so far this spring, but you really have to think about the situation that he was put into. And this is something that you've harped on your podcast, Zach, is he was kind of set up to fail whenever he was kind of thrown into the fire last season. And now he's got a full spring. He's got another year in Harson's system. He's going to get to really learn what the nuances of the system are about. He's going to be able to work on his accuracy. I think something else that he has to work on is his decision-making and his timing. We saw in the Alabama game just several times where it was taking him a really long time to get through his reads. Of course, who wouldn't have a hard time against that Alabama defense, but still, I want to see him kind of pick up the pace in that aspect of the game. But overall, I'm very impressed with the way that Finley has performed throughout spring practice. Obviously, Zach Calzada, like you mentioned, currently injured. It's going to be interesting to see how the quarterback battle shifts whenever he comes back in fall camp, obviously dealing with that non-throwing shoulder injury right now. Could we potentially see this battle kind of morph into a Finley Calzada type of thing in the fall, or is it going to truly be a 3-man, 4-man race by the time the season rolls around?
No, and I think TJ is going to run away with it in the spring just based off of, how these reps are being split up. And then in the fall, I think it's Finley versus Calzada, which is kind of what we all expected going into spring. Maybe some of the D. Davis truthers thought that, maybe he would have a chance to go on a run in spring. And now, obviously, that's not the case anymore. So, reps are just so important, Lance, especially at the quarterback position. And, you mentioned Finley being, a little inconsistent in regards to the Alabama game. But he was that way in all of his appearances last year. But like you said, he was set up to fail. And that wasn't anyone's fault. It's just kind of the nature of it. As a football team and as an offensive unit, you're supposed to get better each and every week throughout the season. That's why you practice. And, the more you do anything with other people that are involved, the better you get at it. And over the course of the season, I think the offense was getting better with Bo Nix. And then obviously Bo Nix, messed up his ankle and TJ Finley was thrust into the action. And this was just an offense that was catered to Bo Nix. I mean, they are different quarterbacks. They have different skill sets. And also, the timing from a quarterback to a wide receiver is extremely important. And then, a lot of people are thinking back to the bowl game. Like, I think Finley was hurt, probably even in the Iron Bowl. And it's just, he's already not a very mobile quarterback. And the fact that his ankle was messed up as well, I think it was Finley's ankle, he couldn't move. And so there just wasn't a whole lot to build around because there wasn't a whole lot there. Tank had a hard time, running the football consistently behind this offensive line. And there were times where Finley would get the ball to a receiver and they would drop it. I mean, there just wasn't a whole lot to really build upon. And that's not TJ Finley's fault. And so I think this will be the first time, Lance, despite him starting several games at LSU as a freshman and then starting, the tail end of the season last year, this will be the first offseason where his coaching staff and a football program is investing in him to be the starter, the planned starter going into the season. And that stuff really matters. It really, really matters because it's, spring is when you build your football team. Fall is when you get ready for the season. And right now they're building this football team around TJ Finley. And I think that's telling.
I'm excited to see what happens with the quarterback battle. I'm excited to see if Finley develops. And that's actually something that we talked about on yesterday's show. We went through expectations for Bryan Harsin and Auburn football in 2022. I want to kind of run down the 4 different categories of expectations that I have and just get your thoughts on what the expectation should be for the Tigers this season. Let's start with development. Expectation for development. Obviously, Gus Malzahn was not the best at developing, I think, skill position players, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Obviously, everybody knows his track record with the quarterback position. Obviously, there's been numerous times where Malzahn has flipped players from offense to defense, and they've been former 4-stars, and they've never really panned out. What have you seen from Bryan Harsin so far, and what should be the expectation for Auburn in terms of developing the players they currently have on roster?
I think it's too soon to tell, but I think the talented players on this team have gotten opportunities. I mean, Tank Bixby was a 1,000-yard rusher, probably should have been more, but I think the offensive line held him back. There were some moments in key games where you're like, okay, I wish Tank would have gotten more touches there. As far as the wide receivers, Kobe Hudson, I think, was a pretty vocal point. I think they kind of got better at using him throughout the year. And so now that may be Javaris Johnson moving forward. We'll have to wait and see. Jay Fair seems to be a guy that could possibly, bust onto the scene in 2022. And then, a guy like John Samuel Shanker, who has the ability, who had the experience, but didn't really have the usage. We saw him have a historic year by Auburn standards last year. And so I think it's too soon to tell, okay, so-and-so on the offensive side has gotten significantly better since Bryan Harsin stepped foot, or at least better compared to, just the natural, you're going to get better every year. Like, the more you do anything, the better you're going to be at it. So I think it's too soon to tell, Lance. I mean, there's no one on this team where I'm like, okay, they should be farther along than they are currently. And so I guess that's a good sign. But, the wide receiver room this year, as far as what their production is going to be, doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Whatever the wide receiver production is, if it exceeds expectations, which I think a lot of Auburn people's expectations are pretty low in regards to production at the wide receiver room, if they come out and be a really strong unit throughout 2022, I think that answers that question. And a lot of people are going to be really pleased with what Bryan Harsin and his staff has done.
Expectations for recruiting. Bryan Harsin, a little bit behind the 8 ball in his first season trying to recruit on the Plains, just had to kind of salvage the class that Gus Malzahn had left. Both recruiting classes under Harsin have been 19th nationally, 7th and 9th in the SEC. There's some work to do on the recruiting front. We're already getting to see some promising things develop. Not a lot of big commits just yet. What should be the expectation for this next year's class?
Yeah, and that second ranking is actually worse. I mean, Auburn is not a top 20 class if you don't count Trey Donaldson. And Trey Donaldson is a basketball player, but he counted in Auburn's football signing class. So take that for what it's worth. I think you got to get better. If you're not going to win in the recruiting front, you've got to win in the transfer portal. And Auburn's not really doing either of those things right now. So you've got to figure that out. Auburn did not help Bryan Harsin with the crap that happened for, that 2-week span earlier in the offseason. I think we all can agree on that. That was not good for Auburn, especially the way it was handled. It even made it somehow worse. So the expectations for that are pretty low just because it's been pretty bad. And it's not all Harsin's fault. I think some of it is, but it's not all Harsin's fault. And so I'm not a guy that thinks you have to be a top 10 recruiting class every year at Auburn with what the transfer portal can bring you. But the fact that Auburn hasn't really added a whole lot so far this offseason going into spring is kind of a bummer. I mean, I think DJ James, the Oregon corner, Jason Jones, the Oregon defensive tackle, Eugene Asante, the North Carolina linebacker, I think those were big wins. And I think all of those guys will be key contributors at different levels of the defense. I think that's exciting. But with these key positions of need for the last 2 off seasons, Auburn has gone after, offensive linemen and wide receivers. And these guys get on campus, and then a few days later, they put out their top 5. And with some of these, Auburn's not even on it. Auburn's not even cutting it. And so it's like, you got to figure that out, Lance. You've got to figure that out if you're Bryan Harsin and the staff. So as far as expectations recruiting, they're probably pretty low.
Yeah, and that's something that we talked about on yesterday's show is that there are 4 SEC teams that only have 1 commit right now, and Auburn's one of them. And it was very similar to last season. Auburn started off very, very slow on the recruiting trail, and you've got to be able to pick it up. I'm not asking right now this early in the cycle for you to have 10 commitments like Arkansas does for the 2023 class. I'm not asking for that, right? But what I'm asking for is for you to be in contention, like you said, with some of these positions of need, wide receiver and offensive line specifically too, that Auburn really, really needs to pick up the pace on. I believe Stanton Ramel is an offensive lineman out of the state of Alabama that Auburn is currently looking at. They potentially might get, but outside of that, I mean, if you look at the in-state recruiting for Auburn right now, they're not really in the running for a lot of different guys. It's mostly Florida, Georgia, or Alabama leans or commits. And so Auburn's got to be able to pick it up recruiting wise. It's not a huge concern for me just yet, but it's definitely one of my bigger areas of concern. Moving along here, expectation for schematics. There were some questionable decisions made by Bryan Harsin and Derek Mason. I think some people were frustrated with the way some games played out last season. Obviously, we talked about this on yesterday's show. The fade on 4th down against Penn State, the continuous use of zone defense, just some weird timing on trick plays. I mean, it was just kind of consistent where it's just like, okay, what are we doing here in terms of calling plays and schematics and different things like that? I think I'll go ahead and say, I think the expectation for 2022 is that those things kind of go away now that Harsin has gotten a year in the SEC and kind of gotten to figure out what things are about. What are the expectations for you in terms of schematics?
I think they're going to be okay. And I think Bryan Harsin being the main guy with the offense with Keysau, I think that's going to be a good move. I really do. I think you're going to see more Tank Bigsby. I think you're going to see more intermediate passing, and I think you're going to see more play action, assuming the offensive line can hold up there. And so that, I think, will make everything better. I think Auburn threw it a ton last year. And I know they were building this offense around Bo Nix and, Mike Bobo liked to pass the ball. I think that's going to change. All this talk that we heard Harsin say when he came in about the 4th and 1 mentality and, this blue collar style of football, I think you're going to see more of that with him kind of being the offensive guy. And defensively, I didn't hate the zone as much as everyone else did. I do think Auburn needs to do more as far as rushing the passer, and they should be better at that this year with Derek Hall and Eku Leota kind of being the guys on the edges. So I'm not as concerned about that. I think you get worse in the defensive backfield, but I'm only saying that because we don't know. I mean, you lose Roger McCreary, it's probably going to be a 2nd-round pick, and then Smoke Monday, who was a long starter, but let's not pretend while Smoke was valuable, let's don't act like he was great in pass coverage. And so I think you have the chance to build something there, and they've got a lot of depth in the defensive secondary. So I think with what Auburn is going to have to defend week in and week out with the SEC getting these, future NFL stars at wide receiver, you may want to play more zone. And I know that's not something that Auburn fans are excited about, but like Roger McCreary is a bump and run man corner. DJ
Yep.
James is not. He played a lot of zone at Oregon. And so, I think they're going to be okay with deciding, whatever they want to do. And if they want to do different things, I think that's a good move. So my expectations for the scheme side of things are actually pretty high, Lance, and they may be higher than they actually should be.
And I think you made a phenomenal point about the zone defense. And that's something that I said on yesterday's show was I think the pass rush, not that last year's pass rush was bad, but I think it's going to be better this season. And it's going to limit time for opposing quarterbacks to make decisions and throw into soft spots into the zone coverage. I don't think fundamentally zone's a bad defense. There's a reason it exists and there's a reason so many different people use it. But
Yeah.
I think that an element of the zone coverage that will make it even better is not allowing the quarterback to pick it apart and find those soft spots. So I think the defensive line is definitely going to wreak havoc this season. I'm excited about that.
I mean,
Finally,
you look at Atlanta, and sorry to cut you off, but I mean, as far as there's just the defensive presence and the push up front. When we talk about Eku and Hall on the edges, but Marcus Harris is a guy that has gained some weight, and if he can keep that first step going, that's going to be exciting as far as rushing the passer and pushing the pocket back into the quarterback. And then obviously Colby Wooden. I mean, those are 4 NFL type guys that are going to be up there. And then Jason Jones is so good at winning at the point of attack as well that we saw him do at Oregon. There's a lot to like about this. And I think they're going to be able to get to the quarterback without having to blitz a whole lot because you did not see them blitz a ton last year. We'll see what the difference is between Derek Mason and Jeff Schmetting as far as calling, sending extra guys to go and get the quarterback. But yeah, I'm with you. I think Auburn's going to be much better defensively than they were a season ago.
And then finally here, expectations for winning. We're not going to go through the entire schedule. I talked about it on yesterday's show, but it sets up nicely. First 5 games at home. You don't necessarily have to put a specific record out there. Just what should be the expectation for Auburn in 2022 in terms of winning?
I think anything better than 6-6, if you're an Auburn fan, you got to feel decent about it. And obviously it depends on how you look in the losses and who, those 7 wins could possibly be. But if Auburn could go 5-0 in those 5 home games, I mean, the big one's Penn State. Can you beat Penn State at home? I think they can. I think in Jordan-Hare Stadium, Auburn can beat anyone. And so the way the schedule lines up, I think helps the Tigers because your toughest 2 games are on the road. And you're probably not going to win those anyway. Like you're probably not going to beat Alabama this year. And so you might as well put it on the road. And you're probably not going to beat Georgia. So you might as well just play it in Athens. And so these games that I think are a coin flip, your LSU, your Texas A&M, your Penn State, like I think it's good that those are at home. And the other coin flips, the Mississippi schools, like it stinks that you got to play in Oxford and it stinks that you got to play in Starkganistan. But I think the Starkville game is winnable, and I think those 3 home games are winnable. And so if you can figure out how to do that, you look up at the end of the season, it's like, oh wow, we survived, and somehow we're 8-4. Like that would be something I think most Auburn fans would be happy with. But Lance, if they can find a way to go 7-5, I think that's enough to kind of get some hope circulating throughout the program.
I think you have to just see some type of improvement, like you said, on a 6-6 record. Zach, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tell everybody where they can find your phenomenal content.
Yeah, it's all at auburndaily.com. This is the Auburn Daily Show, and so be sure to check out everything that I'm writing, that Lance is writing. We've got the best Auburn baseball writer out there with Lindsey Crosby, who I think you're talking to today as well, Lance. So we're really excited to partner with Sports Illustrated to get all of this content up at auburndaily.com every single day, including this show that you're off to a hot start with, Lance.